Okay. Thank you, Sonia. Okay, so this, okay, it's perfect time because this I'm done doing all my talk. I really enjoyed the book, so I could be talking hours about it. But now, so this is how we're gonna play in the program today. What I'm going to do, I'm going to have a short dialogue with Lynsey for 10-15 minutes, just to maybe talk about the big issue at play. And then I will open the floor for Q&A. So if you have questions, you can just jump in and ask questions. Okay. We just have, using RIM, we have like a small rule of engagement. Obviously, we deal with race, so we deal with contested, political, and at times very personal issues. I don't want to police emotion. I think emotion are important. We need to be able to express emotion. What we try to do at RIM is to not to target individuals. Okay, so we focus on the issue, we discuss the issue, but we don't target individuals. Okay, I'm sure Lynsey can deal with that, but I'm not sure I will be able to deal with individual attacks. So please, we keep it focus on the issue. Okay, so Lynsey, this is my first question. My first question is not going to be very original, but I guess it will help us maybe to get directly to the issue at hand. First question is like, your book is called Colored. So what is colored? Why is so much debate about this term, about this concept?
Hi, and thank you for having me. I thank you for that lovely intro also. I want to say that I did not pay you for that intro. But thank you for having me, and thanks for just allowing a conversation and a debate. And I do welcome questions, even if they are controversial or may seem controversial, whatever controversy means these days. But I think, so when we named the book, we thought, we went through a couple different titles, but the working title had always just been colored. And the reason for that is because the word itself is so heavy. The word itself means multiple things in multiple countries. I remember when I first met you, and back in 2008, and South Africans, because the South African way of moving through the world is through race. And we still very much, you know, there's a social act every time South Africans meet where we classify each other. We must figure out what race does this person fall into. And I remember people said to you, you are colored. And you were like, no, I am French and Togolese. And people were like, no, you are colored, right? And it is because it is a South African exercise. It is the legacy of colonialism and apartheid that we continue to have these racial classifications. And so what we found, and the reason we went with this one is because both Tessa and I, when we got this, when the publisher reached out to Tessa and she reached out to me, was to say that, you know, after 94 and as we were growing up in the 2000s, we really thought the word would have fallen away by now. We really thought that this word that had fallen away in the US, had fallen away in the UK, would no longer be used in South Africa once South Africa became a free country. And that just wasn't the case. If anything, people had doubled down on the word itself. You have young children who were born well after 1994, born after 2000, who, when you ask them, what are you, they will say colored. And so the reason we used it is because we know that the word is heavy. And so what we want to do is to talk about all the different ways of being colored. And that's also why the book is written in first person and written through the stories of people. So everyone on the cover, those are real people. They are people who are from, because there's a notion of being, thank you, there's a notion of being colored that you are only from the Cape. And that is simply not true because of the history of South Africa. Coloreds come from across the country. And they come from across the country because the very notion of being colored is so deeply entrenched in the creation of South Africa as a country, post the colonial project and apartheid project, and then post-colonial. So the word itself, colored, the first instance that we found was Cecil John Rhodes. And he used the word coloreds that we could find historically. And he used it to describe a group of people who were still at the time at the Cape. And there were people who were the descendants of enslaved Africans, enslaved Asians. There were people who were the descendants of the displaced Khoi and San groups. And there were people who were pushed together at the Cape Colony in, you know, and the only defining thing was that, the only defining identifier was that they were not so-called native, they were not Xhosa, and they were not white, or they were not European. And so this group of disparate people had come together, were living in certain quarters around the Cape. And because slavery had been abolished, but Cecil John Rhodes needed cheap labor on the recently discovered diamond fields, he made a decree and he said, well, let us use the coloreds because he felt that they might be more easy to control than the so-called native tribes. And so that because they were such a disparate group, that they would be easier to exploit in terms of labor. And that has really played a part throughout colored history, is that exploitation around labor, and also using colored people as sort of a buffer between black and white, because he didn't want to have to deal with native tribes, so-called native tribes. And he just felt that it would just be easier to take a group that didn't seem to have a culture, or who were coming together and forming a culture, and people who were displaced. And so then what that does is that it creates this legacy that continues well into apartheid, where laborers who were, you know, not seen as black, but not seen as white, continue to stay in these communities and continue to live among each other. And so by the time the Population Act comes about, the apartheid government is trying to figure out, well, how will it segment society? And it shows you just how little the apartheid government cared about people of color, because they took research from groups, including I think there was a Wool Growers Association in what is now Mpumalanga. So they basically spoke to farmers and said, if you were going to divide people, how would you do it? And they simply weren't interested in doing it in terms of sort of DNA. They didn't have the technology, and also they just can't be bothered. And so they looked at phenotype. They looked at people who were slightly lighter. They looked at people whose hair, how their hair was shaped, how their hair was formed, or what shape it came out of their skull, which is a ridiculous thing. They looked at what people ate. And they looked at, for example, if you ate pap or if you ate rice, what kind of beer you drank. Those sort of very arbitrary things about what it meant to be a so-called colored. And what that tells us is that the classification itself was incredibly arbitrary, but in that arbitrariness, there was a culture that had been created because there was a specific way of doing things. And that was the creation of culture. And there was a way that even the most racist apartheid official could identify that these people who had come from these disparate groups had come together and formed a culture, even then. And so this is why we chose that one. And I think that kind of explains what it means to be colored. Now, of course, there are different ways of being colored. Just a quick one, for example, in KwaZulu-Natal, where my family is from, colored people are often the product of mixed race relationships. And those relationships differ. They could be relationships that were born out of love, but very often they were relationships that were born out of exploitation. And so there was a recognition of these mixed race or multiracial people, and they were then used to, They were then used to sort of built as a buffer. And they were seen as so-called clans. And so they were a buffer between the British who had taken over Natal, then Natal, and the indigenous Zulu. And they literally put colored communities in between those two so that they wouldn't have to deal with them. Then there was the other way is that during the Great Trek, which was South Africa's pilgrimage of people who now call themselves Afrikaners, when they moved up from the Cape, when the British had taken over the colony and when slavery was abolished, one of the things that is not said often enough is one of the main reasons that they left was because they would lose their labor class. And so they moved along with their animals and their goods, they moved with people. And in the process of the research of this book, I learned that my family came to Northern KwaZulu-Natal because we had come as people who were enslaved. And the reason then is that how they got away was they quite literally ran. During what was then called the Anglo-Boer War, we now know it was the South African Civil War, my ancestors made a run for it at night and took refuge among the British. And that is how we came to be in KwaZulu-Natal. And so what we want people to understand is that it's a complicated term. It's a complex term. And there are many different ways to be colored. And there are people who are of mixed race descent, and there are people who are of so-called colored descent who don't want to use the term. And they feel that it is a relic of apartheid. And that is fair, and that is true. And we're not asking them to use the term. What we're just saying is, let's understand where it comes from. Let's understand our history. So that's it.
Okay, thank you. So you did talk briefly about 1950. So maybe I will focus maybe more on 1950 during the apartheid. You know, when we talk about the apartheid, we focus on these key dates. So we think about like 48 when it started, 94 when it ended. Then we talk often about like 76 with the Soweto uprising, or the 90s with the Mandela's release. But in the book, it seems like if there's one that comes back very often, which is very discussed, is 1950. And then it seems to be like a pivotal year that maybe people should try to understand what happened in 1950 in South Africa.
Yeah, that was the year of the Population Registration Act. And that was the year that classification became law. And that was the year in which, and also what's interesting about it is, and the classification changed. It evolved because the apartheid government, I suppose, perhaps realized its own limitations. But that was the year in which, because maybe I should backtrack a bit and say, one of the things about the inhumanity of apartheid that we sometimes forget is that a large part of the thinking came from labor. It came from the fact that the apartheid, the National Party, felt that it had to protect white workers who had come back from the war. And there were also black workers who were now skilled and had come from the war. And so that they felt that in order to protect white lives, they had to make sure that they were regulated and legislated. And the way that you do that, the way in which you legislate white supremacy, is that you make sure that you can identify who is not white and who is not at the top of the chart. So at the top of the chart are white South Africans, and that is it, at the top of the pyramid. And then how colored identity was then created was, it was a replay of that white supremacy, because what it did was it created not only this class of people who were neither black nor white, but within that group, it also created a class of people, it also created groups of people who were valued according to white supremacy. So for example, if you presented as lighter skinned with straighter hair and might have, one could argue, have Asian ancestry, then you were called Cape colored. If you were darker, looked more black, then you were called other colored. If you could very clearly show, which is a very difficult thing, and it's something that is a very contentious issue today in South Africa. If you could clearly show that you were of the San or Khoi groups, then you were called Hottentot, which is a deeply, deeply offensive word, or a version of that, or Khoi or San. And what it does is that it further creates a segregation within Black groups, right? Because essentially, and this is what Tessa and I have always argued in the book, is that we identify as, we are Black women. We move through the world as Black women, but we are politically Black, but we are culturally colored, and that this is the culture that we have grown up in. And so what that Population Registration Act did was that it used markers of culture, and it used very arbitrary phenotype to segregate communities. And in that segregation also created what you had access to. So if you were lighter skinned, then you were able to perhaps get a job in a shop, or you were working in the front of the shop. If you were really lucky, and there's quite literally a term among colored people called lucky coloreds. If you were really lucky, you could pass a white and marry a white man, or marry a white woman. It was often in the case of women. And you could pass for white, but that means that you give up your family. It means you give up who you are and you never look back. And so this was a rather common occurrence. And for some Black South Africans, wanting to get through, those crumbs that the apartheid government allowed to fall off for Black South Africans, some Black South Africans then tried to be seen as or classified as colored. And so they would change their surnames from Ndlovu, which is isiZulu for elephant, to Olifant, which is the Afrikaans word for elephant. Or, for example, I know in KwaZulu-Natal, we've got families who used to be Nkosi, who are now king. They use the translation, and they use the fact that, that they were perhaps lighter, or that they could somehow convince an apartheid official that they had colored markers. And that's the story of my co-author, Tessa Dooms, who her father, he'd grown up as a Tswana man, and a little Tswana boy, and he's taken into the classification office. And that's when and he's classified as Black, and he comes back home, and he is told that no, the family is actually classified colored because they have a white ancestor. And in that moment, he is ripped from his family. He is no longer allowed to live with them. He is no longer allowed to work in his sister's shop. He is no longer, luckily or unluckily, his family was able to pay a bribe. And so they then got him reclassified. But again, when he tried to be with his Tswana family, who he'd always been with, he was caught by the police, and that's when he left for Johannesburg. And that's the story of so many South Africans, because the other thing is that what the Population Registration Act led to was a raft of other measures. But one of the things was the Group Areas Act, and that decided where you could live, and that decided who you could speak to. And so what you find is people who actually had nothing in common were shoved into townships and forced to create some sort of identity. And that's why that year is so important.
Okay, thank you. So I told you, like, when I got your book, I told you, like, as a marketing scholar, I will just look at marketplace. I will look at marketing and stands, and this is pretty much like an issue with the job. So obviously, I went through it, and marketplace comes a lot, like consumer market issues come a lot. You mention it, and the way they classify people into racial groups with they are natives or whether they are colored was based on consumption. So you had, like you mentioned in the book, you had apartheid official asking the person in interviews, what do they eat for breakfast, what do they eat for lunch, and then what do they drink. If they drink spirits, they would be classified as colored. If they drink home-brewed beer, they would be classified as native. You also mentioned a letter of a lady that sent an email. He sent a letter to the administration, and to say that her husband has been classified in the wrong group because in fact he does eat eat rice, meat, and vegetables. So he's trying, just based on his consumption, trying to be classified into different groups. And then once they get classified, and this is what you show through the book, once they get classified, they have to maintain that classification. If they get classified as color, they have to maintain that classification. And then you show all the politics regarding air practices. And then you had this very rich example when you talk about that experience in that hair salon in the Cape. And this is a very rich example because it shows the ambivalence of how in that space you can get that safe space on the one end for those colored women, but on the other end, they are reproducing historical issues.
Yeah, I mean, so for the book, I wear my hair natural, and I have for a long time. But for the book, I went to go and get what Americans call, I think it's called a press and curl. We call it a blowout. Where you just have your hair straightened, not chemically, just via, heat. And this is a very important ritual for colored women in particular, because hair is one of the easiest ways in which the apartheid government could tell what you were. And so, and not just the apartheid government, but within the community, which is a community that is divided by colorism. Your hair also placed enormous value on what you were able to do and what you were able to get and how far you were able to get in terms of whether it was a husband or a job. And so for so many colored women, the idea of walking around with your hair, what some people call nappy, we call it krus, is just unacceptable because it devalued them. And so then this becomes this ritual of having your hair pressed and curled and made to look as straight as possible so that you could pass for white or get as close to being white as possible. And what that means is that it creates a safe space in the sense that, this is like a barbershop for men, I suppose. This is where women show up entirely as who they are, that our roots quite literally show, that you show that your roots are not straight, and that you participate in this ritual because the hairdresser knows what the purpose of the ritual is. You know what the purposes of the ritual is. It's to hide, to an extent, what your natural hair looks like, to hide who you probably really are. And I don't want to put too much emphasis on identity and hair, but I think it plays an important role in how particularly women of color move through the world and what we are able to and allowed to do with our hair. And so it creates a safe space where people see your roots. It has created a space in which women of color are able to own their own businesses. In every neighborhood, if you were not wealthy, but you knew how to do hair, that was a way to make money and to feed your family. And the hairdresser that I went to was a single mother who had found a little shop in a small town, and it's still an incredibly racially segregated town, in which is one of the wealthiest retirement towns in South Africa. But the Black and colored communities in those towns are so impoverished, and they are right next to each other. And what I found so fascinating is, as we were talking about race, and talking about what it was like to live in this town, the town is called Hermanus. You know, white supremacy is so, and internalized racism is so deeply set in a sense of identity there, where their anger wasn't the anger at their circumstances that still looked so much like their particular circumstances. They weren't angry at the white community that had become even richer after the end of apartheid. They were angry at the Black community against whom that they felt that they were competing for economic opportunities. And it's that same story from apartheid, where colored South Africans and Black South Africans were pitted against each other in order to fight for the crumbs of what the apartheid government would let you have, while the entire society was built for the benefit of white South Africans. And so, you know, it's where these difficult conversations can happen. And just, I suppose, the other thing just about consumerism and the role that it played. When you come from a culture like ours, in which you don't have a national dress, and in which your language is one that has been creolized from a European language, which is Afrikaans. The majority of colored people speak Afrikaans, and so some call it a version of it, like Kaaps, or but either ways, it's a creolized Dutch. And when you don't have what people see as the markers of an African culture, you're required to create it. And so what happens is, and particularly in expressions of masculinity, brand names became really important for young men growing up in townships. A certain brand name said that you were, aspiring. A certain brand name showed that you were a respectable man. Or a certain brand name showed that you were part of a certain gang, because the options for colored men was that you were either a very respectable man, you were either part of the Boy Scouts, you were a pastor or an imam, because a large part of our population is also Muslim, or you were the complete opposite, in that you were a gangster or a scully. And so brand names and consumerism play a big role in how colored men present themselves to the world, and how they present with these two extremes. There's very little nuances allowed for colored men in particular. And we found that it's not just with Saudi, I shouldn't say in particular, because it's not just colored men. It was the similar pattern with Black men in Soweto, who were also forced into an area because of the Group Areas Act, were also forced to recreate a sense of culture and identity, and leaned on these brands, these consumer brands, to show who they were as urban Black South Africans, and for colored people as either a respectable colored man or a complete sort of subversive version of masculinity.
Yeah, in the book you talk about like wearing whiteness. You said that when you talk about those brands, and this is something like Rim Scholar. Like we have colleagues that write about like selling whiteness, and this is something that I deal very, very close. Maybe just the last question before we move to the Q&A. As I discussed with you, we did face some criticism with the flyer of the talk today, because one key critique was that the flyer didn't mention colored people involvement with white supremacy and anti-blackness, and in the flyer we did use your book description, and this was the critique towards the flyer, towards the book description. But when you read the book, it's there everywhere. Like you've got that expression, proximity to whiteness, and it's not only about race. You're not only critiqued towards color, the colored culture, which is a culture in terms of race, but also in terms of gender. You talk about like sexism, about homophobia, you talk about gang, you talk about many things, even like if towards you critical, but towards Africans and all of your book is very critical. But the question is like your book description is not critical. So then
Yeah.
my thing is like, why is this that gap? So I may have some explanation, but I wanted to know what is that difference between your book and your book description. I'm sure you've maybe thought about it.
I mean, the book description is a couple of reasons. One is just straight up consumerism. The publishers just felt that that was probably the best version of that to put on the book jacket. But also, you know, when we talk about complicity, I think we use the word, and when we say complicity, what exactly do we mean by complicity? Because as a dark-skinned colored woman, and some people might go, you're not dark-skinned. In my community, I am. As a woman who wears her hair like this, in an afro, that is also seen as an act of subversion. And I was not sure when I got this book assignment whether I even wanted to write a book about a community that, quite frankly, had made my life difficult. You know, that did practice anti-Blackness, and of which I did experience that anti-Blackness, in which I continue to experience that anti-Blackness. And I think my own journey in the book and writing the book was to truly understand what internalized racism is, and to truly understand how insidious white supremacy is. And so and you see this in respectability politics, you see it in anti-Blackness within Black communities. You see it in what some people call the oppression Olympics, where, you know, one Black group feels that they perhaps have suffered more than another at the hand of white supremacy, when we are doing the work of introspection, but white supremacy is not doing the work of introspection. And so what I have learned is that, just in terms of how I see this, is there is a deep sense of anti-Blackness in the colored community. Just in, you know, in some communities I found in the United States that didn't want to be seen as African or African-American, or didn't want to be seen as Black. I remember once being, you know, my very narrow experience of New York, I was only there for a year, but I spoke to some Dominicans and called them Black, and they were upset with me, you know. And I guess that's the experience, because there's no one way of being Black, right? But what that shows us is that white supremacy has created a segregation that is not just in the signs and in our ID books, but it is a deeply internalized sense of self, about how we move through the world as Black people, and how we are how we've been put into tiers, and how hard it is to break down those tiers. And so for colored communities, for example, the reason this book even came to be was in 2020, during the George Floyd protests that had spread throughout the world. I grew up in a community, in a township, and a community that has faced police brutality, and it also has a history of gangsterism. And a young boy with Down syndrome had been shot. And the hashtag that emerged, instead of Black Lives Matter, was Colored Lives Matter. And this was deeply problematic. And we were able to have a discussion about that. And it's like, why do colored people not feel that they are Black still to this day? And it comes back to the thing that I said at the beginning, why does this word still persist? And colored communities in South Africa feel that they have been left behind. They feel that they were not Black enough, they're not white enough during apartheid, and they are currently not Black enough under the new regime. They feel that they have been isolated, and they feel like there are no opportunities. The reality, of course, is that the colored experience does not differ to the experience of any group who is stuck in a township or stuck in an underserviced rural area. Just the colored neighborhood I grew up in is across the road from Soweto and is legally part of Soweto. But the division created by apartheid is so deep, that canyon between us is still so deep, that sense of anti-Blackness still exists, and a sense of resentment by Black people to colored South Africans. But what I am also learning is a lack of understanding of who colored people are by Black South Africans it is still deeply entrenched 30 years after the end of these classifications. And so I think, so that explains the anti-Blackness, and that's the introduction of the book. We explain how we got to this, from Black Lives Matter to Colored Lives Matter, and how that brought about this book and this introspection. But ultimately, and it comes back to why this book is about, that it's not we'd like to think that it's not an academic book. We think of it as a book about people's lives. Because what we also find is with internalized racism is that is the deep sense of a lack of value. And colored people do not feel valued. There is a deep sense of self-doubt, a deep sense of self-hatred. And ultimately, what we wanted people to walk away from is to feel seen, is to feel heard, is to feel that they are part of the South African story and that their history is part of South Africa's history. So that is why, what we wanted was, rather than a critique of coloredness, what we wanted was a reclamation. That whatever you decide to call yourself at the end of the book, that you understand the makings of this culture and how we got here in the first place.
Thank you very much. I think the book does the job for sure. Thank you. Maybe it's time for me to, I guess I will have more questions, but it's not, I cannot just keep you for myself. So I need to share with the RIM community. And maybe I don't know if anyone's got questions, please feel free to raise your hand or just to pop in. I don't see any in the chat. Maybe in the chat you raise your hand, or maybe there's a way I can see hands.
No, seems like a pretty quiet group.
There's no question. Oh, there, Kevin. Hello, Kevin. Can you hear us? Oh. Oh yeah.
Hi, Guillaume, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. All good.
Okay. Lynsey, thanks so much for the presentation. Yeah. And Guillaume, thanks for lending us your name. I'm sure you realize there's a few Guillaumes in there. We are neglected, I think, to register earlier. We thought we'll be able to register and go in, and the system said we should register a bit earlier. Yeah. When I saw this, Lynsey, I'll address you through Guillaume. It'll probably be a lot easier. Yeah. When I saw this, Guillaume, it was a real shock on my side that this is really coming into RIM. But I think how I wanted to take it through, really, Guillaume, is I myself, having lived in the UK and having found myself being classified separately from Afro-Caribbeans, and maybe for Lynsey's sake, I am colored when I face the world. But my first language is Zulu, so then I go through all sorts of reclassifications and all that stuff. Yeah, so so my identity faces the fluidity, that which we face. But when I'm being given some sort of priority unfairly due to my skin color, it's always very painful for me. That I always have to receive things on behalf of people who deserve them. So it's I just wanted to kind of put that slightly on the side, and then just move on to say moving to the UK for me was the most fantastic thing, because there was no debate. I was Black and I was African, and there was just nothing about that. And if I said I had a parent who was white, it was a joke, ha ha ha, but you got a Black one, so you go there. So that was, for me, that resolved lots of things. But then the main tension I had was that my brother, my sister who was Black and had been in the UK for a few generations and had come to the UK via the Caribbeans, was called an Afro-Caribbean and was almost presented as culturally different from me, and this was a bit of a problem. And to some extent, when we go to America with Black America, I'm not sure of the intensity. I haven't lived a lot, but I do know that in some cases, there is a bit of a cultural issue that we don't understand each other, that maybe we have access to an African language and maybe in Black America, that isn't there, and that could create a bit of, I'm not sure what kind. So for me, I think with RIM, I thought that our main problem was to really try and see how do we resolve this with a common denominator of embracing an African culture. Okay, so I think to RIM, this to me is my issue, to say RIM exists to say the common denominator to all the subjugation is melanin. It's the African origins, and that's what we really want to reclaim. To the extent that we do this, I've read about this, and I know it leaves even within somebody who is Black, so not somebody like myself who has a mixed identity. If you're slightly fairer, there is, in South Africa, we've got the term yellow bone and all sorts of things, that we have these issues of, color and, this hierarchies. But we say, what we're reclaiming, if it's our Blackness, we actually value the more Black. So if we're looking at this race as a social construct, for white people, they value whiteness, they value beauty as blonde, even if they're not blonde, So for us here, and I think somebody was just reminding us that Steve Biko, I'm not sure if we all know who he is, but he was not fighting for a Black-only world. But what he was doing with Black consciousness was engaging that if the thesis is white supremacy, then the antithesis should be Black consciousness. So in our case here, what we're really looking at is an identity that is gravitating, that is moving towards Africanness, for a uniting, so that we try to move towards creating a common identity. And I think that's what I see RIM as. And the problem here now that we were facing, that came right in my face, was to say, coloredness. When I came to Cape Town, I thought, driving here, I remember, for the first time, I'll be part of a majority. And I came here later on and I began to understand it, was that its definition, and now you put it this way here, it embodies a deep sense of anti-Blackness. So that for me was really difficult. And I don't know if I want to bring in the example of, during apartheid in South Africa, we had Black people. So I want to move away from, say, a colored identity, because I find sometimes it's a bit more, this really to me is probably a bit more controversial. But when I move into the Black community where somebody is also Black and worked as a policeman or worked for the army, and their job was really to kill their own brother, to say, after apartheid, what happens? Is it a platform for them to come and say they've an identity constructed on these injustices? And what do we do? Or do they come in and reclaim an African identity? And for me, I'm really struggling with this, to say, where is it coming into RIM? Because if we're building any other identity, and I'm not sure here if what RIM fills, but for me, I think we need to create a common identity, identity where we kind of are saying, where there's more melanin. This is probably what we want to look at. Yeah, sorry, it's a bit of a long engagement, but I'm hoping necessarily so to go to and from. Thank you.
So I guess this is a question directing to RIM, or to you. Yeah, so maybe to RIM. I think it's a big question of RIM if we just focus on skin color. I think it's a debate we're having if we tend to focus on racialization process, not really only on skin color. So I would believe that melanin is related to only skin issue, but we tend to focus on race. So for me, it's difficult to give a definite answer on that.
I mean, I'm just an outsider, so I'm just listening. But what I found interesting was the idea of an African identity, and as a common African identity, and a common Black identity. And what I'm learning this is what the United States taught me. And I learned it as I moved through the world, is that there's no single way to be Black. And there's no single way to be African. And so what happens is and I understand why we do it, because in a struggle against white supremacy, we need a rallying call. And so what I think might have happened in that process, and this is what we find when, particularly with the generation of colored people who don't want to be seen as colored, understandably, is because there might be a flattening of a Black identity. There might be an identity that is built in opposition to whiteness. And what we are saying is that our identity does not exist because we are not white. What we are saying is that we have always been here, and that we are seeking a new language in which to describe our myriad experiences of what it means to be Black. And so, while Black consciousness has laid the foundation for us, I think what has really deeply helped me was the experience of Black feminists, particularly Black American or African American feminists, because I don't want to prescribe to people what they want to be identified as, and the idea of intersectionality, and the idea that I can be multiple things at different times. I move through the world similarly as a woman. I move through the world as a Black woman. I move through the world as an African. I move through the world as a colored woman. I move through the world as a Black South African, all at the same time. And so I think when we're thinking about race, for us at least, it's been a case of, and again, I don't know what Rim's thoughts on this are, but I just, when I hear a question around a common identity, my worry is that it is a flattening of experiences. And particularly as a woman, often, then my experience gets flattened. And so that's why I lean on intersectionality quite a bit to help me move through the world and help me move through these different spaces all at the same time. And so that would just be my contribution.
Any other questions? Trevor?
Hi, Lynsey. Thank you for the presentation. I really learned a lot. I'd actually like to talk to you more about the New York context. I like that story that you shared about the Dominicans. I study racial commodification in the tourism industry in Harlem. And right now I'm working on how Latino tourism interests have been marginalized in Harlem and in favor of privileging like Black history. And I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit more about like and I don't like to use this term because it's an offensive term in the States, this notion of coloredness. If you could speak a little bit more about that category and how other racial categories might be involved. The way you describe it, it seems like really a category based on mixture in many ways, as opposed to like a pure Blackness. And so I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the distinctions between like sort of the category colored and that of Blackness, and how these two have been like pitted against each other, excuse me, historically.
I think thanks for that. I can't speak to the Latino experience in New York. What I can speak to is my own experience of it, and looking at people who look like me. And I did the same thing. I flattened the experience. I just assumed that their hair, and I just assumed that that this was going to be their culture. And I did the same thing that the South Africans do, is that we racially classify everyone that we encounter instead of just allowing people to just move, present themselves and say who they are. But what the experience about being colored is, being mixed, and so-called miscegenation does play a part in it. But it's not all of what it is. I think what it really is historical. And it's how a group of people came to be. And what's difficult about being colored, but it's painful about being colored, is that our entire sense of culture and identity comes from a sense of subjugation. So you have they were enslaved people brought from Angola, Mozambique, and they were not allowed to speak their language. Little known, for some reason, it's not well known that South Africa was a slave port, and that it had not unlike the Caribbean islands, you had people who were brought together and were forced, and the United States as well, who were forced then to speak a particular language. In our case, it was Dutch. And so, those people could not also be, some were able to run away and join local groups, but they were also rejected because you were not enough, and we don't know you, and you don't speak our language, and you don't know our culture. So there's a deep sense of rejection coming from that. And so that's how this group comes together. And being mixed then comes along also from the sense of being mixed within not just black and white, but right. Indian, East African, West African, just a mix of and a creation of what it means then to be black, or what it means to be colored afterward. Because I think we have I wonder about, like, for example, when one says, what does it mean to be pure black? I don't know. I certainly, my white ancestors do not claim me, and I do not claim them. And my experience, and I found this, my experience of moving through the world is that that's the world just sees me as black, and that's just it. I don't know if that answers, if that helps your question at all, but it's just a complexity of identity. And I think the space to be able to have those conversations, I think, is pretty important.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it seems like not just like sort of miscegenation, but also like ethnic mixture. There seems to be sort of like a diasporic, a really strong diasporic element to the category of colored. So yeah, it's new for me to learn about. So I really appreciate all your explanations. So thank you.
Colonialism, we don't talk about that enough.
Sure.
Yeah.
Veronica. Hello.
Hi, hello there. Hi, Jill. Thank you, Lynsey. Thank you so much. I've got your book and I haven't been plowing through it enough, but I just wanted to amplify. You said, there isn't a one way of being black. Black is not monolithic. And I don't think being colored, I don't think there's one way of being colored as well. I'm South African. I always describe myself as black. And although I was socialized colored, I grew up in Durban. I went to a colored school. And I'm very intentional in saying that I'm politically black and not really. I say I'm socialized colored. And that's because I still find the tension, as you mentioned earlier, that blacks have been pitted against coloreds, and we were both scrambling for the crumbs that fell off the white table. And that tension is still there. And when I'm in Cape Town, I do a lot of diversity work. When I'm in Cape Town and I describe myself as black in my introductions, the way I start my workshops. In one of the workshops, a colored woman said to me, Veronica, why do you call yourself black? You should be colored. You must say you're colored, and with this gesture, and I don't want to be insensitive or rude by kind of, mimicking the accent with which it was said. But I was chided in my workshop about calling myself black, and that I should do better and call myself colored. So I just wanted to bring that in as the tension that sadly is still between us in South Africa, in our coloredness, in our blackness, and in our intersectionality. The pain body is present in all of it. Thank you for being here this evening, Lynsey.
Thanks. I mean, yeah, it's my co-author, Tessa and friend, she says, when we do this to each other, we do the work of verwoord. We do the work of the apartheid official. They might be long dead, but we continue their work through our colorism and our internalized racism and our, it just, and so I think a lot of it also comes from a lack of understanding of each other. And even though we live across the road from each other, we have, our societies have been structured and our resources have been structured around our division. And so it benefits when we don't know each other, benefits white supremacy and benefits this white system of racial, systemic racism when we don't know each other. And I think that's partly where those responses come from. Like, no, we must continue this division because this is how it has always been. But that is not how it always has to be.
Yeah, yeah. And the language and accent are a big part of this conversation as well. So many colored people do not and choose not to speak an African language, you know? And again, you know, I can speak a bit of Zulu. It's not, you know, English is my first language. And I'm often marginalized in completely Black, maybe Zulu or isiZulu, or isiXhosa speaking context, because I'm not fluent. So the pain of that is that then I become accused as somebody who wanted to be classified colored during apartheid, and that's why I can't speak my language. So it's very painful and complicated and very complex.
And we do talk about language, and just my family is from KwaZulu-Natal, northern KwaZulu-Natal, and so we are Zulu speaking. My Zulu is not great, but the rest, because I grew up in Johannesburg, sadly, so I speak Joburg Zulu. But my family's Zulu is fluent. And when our church services are in isiZulu. And what we found from both sides is that one side says your Zulu is not good enough, and the other side says, oh, so you're not one of us because you speak isiZulu. And, you know, culturally also, because our great-grandmother is Zulu, that culture stays with us. So we have created a version of coloredness that leans heavily on being Zulu. And so what that means for us is then we're not Zulu enough, but we're not colored enough either. And it was something that I struggled with for ages, but what I have learned since is that we are, as I said, repeating the work of the apartheid official, and that has been the rallying cry for so many colored people to say that we are not Black enough, but we are not white enough. And it's a deep sense of rejection, and it's a deep sense of pain. And so you are carrying this pain from colonialism, from slavery, from apartheid, from being rejected as the Black child of a white father. And what we found in talking to people for this book, because we really, really wanted to tell people stories, is that people told the most painful stories of rejection in the most matter-of-fact way. Like they just delivered it like it was, they were reading a grocery list. And I, you know, as the person on the other side, I am heartbroken for them. But because this has been their story, they just repeat it. And so what happens then is, and we realize that is the story of colored South Africans, but it is the story of Black South Africans, and it is the story of everyone who has experienced oppression and white supremacy, is that our pain has become matter of fact. And I think that we need to, that is no longer acceptable. And how, you know, we need to have conversations about how to fix that. Can I just switch on my light while I'm busy with this?
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know, we were supposed to end like 20 minutes ago. I don't know if there's any other questions, but if there's a question that I don't want to cut it now, I think the conversation is rich. If people wants to go, I think they're free to go. We will not get upset. But if there's any specific question you would like to ask Lynsey, before we call it for the end of the day. We're all good? Okay. So thank you very much. Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you very much, Lynsey, for coming, for taking time to come and present your book to discuss about this important issue with us. You did it very clear, it's very, very rich, and yeah, and we learn a lot today. So
thank you so much.
You
thank
all.
you for having me. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Lynsey. Thank you.
Thank you for a robust conversation. I appreciate that. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everyone.
Bye.